Hi, everybody, and welcome to the lecture on persuasion. So we're still talking in general about social influence, so how our behaviors and our attitudes are influenced by other people. And we've already talked about conformity in a prior lecture. So now we're going to talk about a different type of social influence, which is persuasion. And what we're going to see is that one of the general themes that has come out of social psychology so far that we've discussed is that people behave sometimes without a whole lot of careful or deliberate thought. So in the section on social cognition, we saw that one of the reasons that people use heuristics, for example, is because they're either not motivated to think in depth or because they don't have the ability to think in depth. And so they respond using rule of thumb rules instead of having to think about something in depth. And that same idea that people behave almost mindlessly is going to form a central component of the main theory that's used in persuasion in social psychology, which is known as the elaboration likelihood model. That's why in the title it says mindlessness, and the ELM, that's an acronym for elaboration likelihood model that we will discuss shortly. So when we talk about persuasion, um, one of the things we're talking about is our attempts to change attitudes. So, for example, through commercials or advertisements, right? So, if you look at some sample ads, these are all attempts to change people's opinions or their attitudes towards a product. If you develop a more positive attitude towards Mercedes-Benz, for instance, then you're more likely to buy their cars, right? And so, advertisers are in the business of persuasion, of changing attitudes. And this is true for products. It's true for all businesses, et cetera, et cetera. It's true for things like behavioral changes, health behavior. So this is an attempt to change people's attitudes towards vaccinations, measles vaccinations in particular. This is a classic poster, Rosie the Riveter. This was created during World War II when basically the men were off fighting the war in Europe. There was a need to replace a lot of workers in the US. And so there's an encouragement to change women's attitudes towards joining the workforce. So again, an attempt to change attitudes. So it falls under the purview of persuasion. Or you can also look at sort of different propaganda posters. This is a poster that was, I believe this was generated by America and sent to soldiers to discourage them from sleeping with women abroad because they didn't want their soldiers to catch sexually transmitted diseases because they might have to take them out of the war, right? So there were attempts to change their attitudes towards foreign women. And if we're talking about propaganda, then of course it's hard to do so without talking about Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler, who used all sorts of propaganda in attempt to change Germany's attitude, the people of Germany's their attitudes towards the Nazi regime, etc. Okay. These are all different attempts at persuasion. As we can see with the propaganda, these attempts, they don't even have to be based in truth, right? That's what propaganda is. It's often lies or things that aren't true to try to change people's attitudes. So we usually define persuasion in social psychology in the following ways as efforts to change others' attitudes, as I've been mentioning. We are going to see in later sections, when we look at different types of social influence, that there's other types of social influence that attempt to change people's behaviors directly by either requesting something or demanding something. That isn't necessarily the case with persuasion. I mean, the idea is that if you change your attitude, then your behaviors will follow. But the direct attempts are usually on changing your attitudes, not on changing your behaviors directly. That's sort of indirectly once your attitudes are changed. And as I mentioned, one of the themes of this section is that people behave mindlessly. In other words, they behave a lot of the time without a lot of careful or deliberate thought. What that means is that if we make decisions without careful thought, if other people know this who are trying to persuade us, they may be able to persuade us using irrelevant details, right? They may be able to persuade us not by making a rational, logical argument for why we should develop a certain attitude, but by manipulating us in ways that maybe we shouldn't be manipulated. So we're going to take a look at that in a second. Because what this means is that we're often persuaded by these unimportant variables, variables that shouldn't really matter, but do because we're susceptible to them because we're behaving sort of mindlessly. And I want to give you a couple examples of what I mean by this. First example I'll give you is a relatively famous study from the 70s, where a woman by the name of Ellen Langer conducted a study at her university. And what she did is she went to the library and she basically disabled all of the photocopiers in the library so that people who were in the library who wanted to make copies all got in one line behind the only photocopier that worked. And what she did is she sent some research assistants to this library and had them try to cut in line. And they did so in one of three ways. So first off, we're going to start from the left. There were people who gave no excuse for why they needed to cut in line. They would simply go up to people in line and say, "Excuse me, can I cut in front of you?" And they recorded what percentage of people allowed this person to cut in front of them. So when people gave no excuse, then about 60% of people agreed to let this person cut in front of them. I think it's pretty generous in general of these people. In a second condition, research assistants went up to people in line and said, "Excuse me, can I cut in front of you? I'm in a rush." Okay, well, that's kind of a valid excuse, right? Maybe you're in a rush to get somewhere. So it makes sense that you would need to cut in front of someone. As a consequence, if you give people a reasonable excuse, such as "I'm in a rush," that raises the compliance rate or the persuasion rate. Now, in this case, I think it was 94% of people allowed this person to cut in front of them. Okay, that makes sense. You give people a rational excuse, it increases the likelihood they agree to it. But what's most interesting is this in this third condition, because in this third condition, people would go up to people in line and say, "Excuse me, can I cut in front of you? I need to make some copies." Now, if you think about this for a second, of course that's the case because everyone needs to make copies. That's why they're in line for the photocopier. So effectively saying, "Can I cut in front of you? I need to make copies," is not really a valid excuse at all. Now, so if people were paying attention to this, they would recognize that this is not a valid excuse, and you'd expect that the number of people who would allow this person to cut in front of them, it should be about the same as people who gave no excuse, right? Because this is effectively no real excuse. But actually what happens is in this case, you had 93% of people agreeing to let this person cut in front of them. In other words, the people let them cut in front of them even though the excuse was not valid. It didn't matter, in fact, if the excuse was valid, such as "I'm in a rush," or if it was invalid, such as "I need to make some copies." People allowed this person to cut in front of them regardless. Why is that the case? Well, it's the case, or the argument is that when we hear someone make an excuse or ask us for something, we're not really analyzing the content of their excuse. Rather, what we hear is something like, "Excuse me, can I cut in front of you because blah, blah, blah." And as long as they give something that sounds like it's in the form of an excuse, then that's what influences us. The content doesn't actually influence us. And the reason for that is because we behave in a mindless way. In other words, we're not thinking about the content of the excuse. We just think like, "Oh, they said something that sounds like an excuse, so that's good enough." So again, this emphasizes this idea that people behave sort of mindlessly. This is another study where researchers were simply asking people for money on the street, and they did so with one of two requests. So half the time they made a typical request. They asked people, "Can you spare a quarter?" If you're walking downtown, you might have heard people ask you for like $1 or something, like these standard requests you've heard many, many times before. In a second condition, researchers made an atypical request. "Can you spare 37 cents?" Or sometimes they said, "Can you spare 17 cents?" A very specific number that you've probably never heard anyone ask you for that number before, right? They usually ask you for a quarter or $1 or something like that. And at the end of the day, they simply counted up how much money they made using each of these two requests. And what you can see here is that when people made an atypical request, such as "Can you spare 37 cents or 17 cents?" they made more money than people who made a typical request, "Can you spare a quarter?" Now, why is that the case? Well, if you're walking down the street and someone makes a typical request, so let's say someone asks you, "Hey, can you spare $1?" Because we've been asked that question probably many times before, we sort of have this automatic response to it. So you might say, "No, sorry, I don't have any money," right? It's a response you might have given many, many times before. And so when someone makes that request, that response is right there. You just say it and you go on. But when someone makes an atypical request, it gets us thinking more. It breaks us out of mindlessness. If someone asks you, "Can you spare 37 cents?" you start thinking like, why do they need exactly 37 cents? It's sort of, you don't really have this automatic response to that question because we haven't been asked it before. So it gets you to think about the nature of their request. And maybe you think they need exactly 37 cents to finish some purchase or something that they want to make. And because you're thinking more, you're actually more persuaded by that question. And so people donate more money as a consequence. So this is demonstrating that breaking people out of mindlessness can increase the extent to which they're persuaded, at least under certain conditions. But the point here is that people often behave in a mindless manner. That's the main point. So if we look at the dominant theoretical model in social psychology, it's out of the way again, that social psychologists use to examine the process of persuasion, that model is known as the elaboration likelihood model. And the elaboration likelihood model has a basic assumption, which is related to this concept of mindlessness, which is that people oftentimes don't have either the motivation or the ability to evaluate messages carefully. In other words, if you're given a lot of information, in order to fully process it and analyze it, you have to both be able to think about that information, meaning you have to have the brain capacity necessary to do so. You have to not be distracted by other things, et cetera, et cetera. And you also have to have the motivation to want to read that information thoroughly because we don't really like to think. We behave mindlessly, right? And so a lot of the time, if we're not motivated to analyze something in depth, we'll simply skim it or we don't really read it. We don't really pay attention to it. So in order to evaluate something in depth, we have to have both ability to think in depth and motivation to think in depth. And a lot of the time, we don't have at least one of those two things. And as a consequence, under those conditions where we either lack ability or lack motivation, that's when we're behaving mindlessly. That's when we're able to be persuaded by more superficial, more meaningless variables. And this fact was known by many people prior to the development of the elaboration likelihood model. So, for instance, take this quote: "The receptive ability of the masses is very limited, their understanding small. On the other hand, they have a great power of forgetting." In other words, people behave mindlessly. And when people understand that a lot of people behave mindlessly, then they're able to manipulate them, which is why it's rather regrettable that the person who made this comment is Adolf Hitler. He understood how to manipulate people at some level because of this mindless tendency that they often have. Now, according to the elaboration likelihood model, there's sort of two routes through which we can be persuaded. And which route you go on depends on your motivation and ability to think in depth. So I want to explore that a little bit more. So these two routes are the following. First off, there's what's known as the central route. If you are on the central route to persuasion, then what that means is that you are motivated to think in depth and you are able to think in depth. If you're on the central route to persuasion, you analyze the arguments that are being given you. This is when you're thinking. This is when you're motivated, right? And you want to think and analyze an argument. On the other hand, you could also be on the peripheral route to persuasion. And you're on the peripheral route if you are either not motivated to think. I can't get this out of the way. Let me put this over here. If you're either not motivated to think or you're not able to think, then you're on the peripheral route to persuasion. This is when you're not analyzing the strength of arguments, but rather you're more likely to be manipulated by these more superficial variables. So let's explore those routes a little bit more. Okay. So first off, let's explore the central route. So as I mentioned, because people are motivated to think and are able to think if they're on the central route to persuasion, this is when they're going to analyze things like the quality of the arguments that are being made or the logical coherence of those arguments. So if you take like a beer ad, for instance, this is an ad for Miller Lite, then what they're doing in this ad is saying, look, our beer has fewer calories, it has fewer carbs, therefore it's better for you, basically, or less unhealthy, I guess, than Bud Light, right? They're making arguments that make sense, that are relevant potentially to the decision you're making, right? How many calories does this drink have? An attitude change via the central route tends to be more long lasting. Okay. So when people analyze an argument, if you're a Bud Light drinker and you look at this ad and you decide, oh, wait a second, Miller Lite has fewer calories, fewer carbs. I'm concerned about watching my caloric intake. So I'm going to go with Miller Lite. That attitude change tends to last longer if it was made on the basis of logical arguments via the central route. Here's another example. This is a home for sale. And it says, enjoy the holidays in this elegant residence set among high hedges and English gardens on over 2 acres, offered exclusively for $3.25 million. What this ad is doing is it's giving you information that's relevant to your decision. Here's what the house looks like. It's set among high hedges and English gardens. It's on 2 acres. It's offered for $3.25 million. This is all information that's relevant to the decision making that people are engaging in when deciding whether to buy this house or not. right? So both of these are examples of ads that are aimed at people who are on the central route to persuasion, people who are motivated and able to think about the arguments that are being made. But in contrast to the central route is the peripheral route. This is when, as I mentioned before, when people are not motivated or able to think in depth. And as a consequence, they're persuaded not by the arguments that are being made because they're not considering the arguments, they're not analyzing them, but rather they're persuaded by more simple cues that are present within a given situation. That can mean a whole lot of things. Okay. So, for example, take this ad here where you've got Ronaldo, soccer player, selling KFC, right? Now, if you think about this for a second, why does Ronaldo have anything to do with KFC, right? Why should we be more likely to buy KFC because it's being endorsed by a soccer player, right? If anything, you think a soccer player would eat healthy and so would be less able to know about KFC or less knowledgeable about it or would use that product a lot less, right? Logically speaking, it doesn't really make sense. But because when we're on the peripheral route and we're not really analyzing arguments and we're influenced by these superficial variables, one of those variables is celebrity. In other words, we tend to be influenced by celebrities more than non-celebrities if we're on the peripheral route, even if the celebrity has nothing to do with the product that's being sold in this case. An attitude change via the peripheral route tends to be much shorter lived than attitude change via the central route. So, in other words, you might be temporarily convinced to buy KFC because Ronaldo is selling it in this instance. But because it was a very superficial sort of way in which your attitude was changed, it doesn't tend to last a long time. Okay. It tends to be much more temporary. So here's another ad that's aimed at people who are on the central route. This is selling beer. And what we see here is like an attractive model holding beer in her hand, right? But what does that have to do with the quality of the beer? Why are they using an attractive person? There's nothing related to her attractiveness that's related to beer, right? That doesn't make a logical argument for why you should buy it. And that's because when people are, again, are on the peripheral route, they're not thinking about the logical coherence of the ad. They're simply influenced by things like the attractiveness of the speaker. Okay. Um, there are all sorts of these peripheral route cues that can affect people. So we looked at celebrity and attractiveness, but things like humor, ads that have humor in them that are funny, tend to be more influential to people on the peripheral route than ads that don't have humor, even if the humor is completely unrelated to the product that's being sold. Or we can look at the fluency of the arguments that are being made. So you can imagine that if someone comes and speaks to you and is trying to change your opinion on something, if they sound very fluent and eloquent, we tend to be persuaded by them compared to if they sound less fluent, if they're kind of stuttering a little bit or it's kind of jilted the way that they're talking, it doesn't quite flow properly. We're more influenced by fluency, by fluent arguments than less fluent arguments. But that has nothing to do with the quality of the arguments that are being made, right? You can make just as high quality arguments if you're not eloquent than if you are eloquent, right? So the fluency or the eloquence of the speaker shouldn't matter. And it doesn't matter if you're on the central route to persuasion, but if you're on the peripheral route to persuasion, it tends to matter. Or one thing that people will do when deciding if they're going to change their attitude based on a speaker is they'll consider how many arguments the speaker is making. So, for example, let's say that you're watching a debate between two people, and the first debater gives two arguments for their side, and the second debater gives five arguments for their side. Okay. Without even considering what the arguments are, you might just be more persuaded by the person who's making five arguments compared to two, because they gave five arguments, right? Now, again, that doesn't speak to the quality of the arguments, because if you're on the peripheral route, you're not examining or analyzing the quality of the arguments. So the number of arguments that are being made is not a really good factor that we should consider on its own to determine if we should be persuaded by something. We should be considering the quality of the arguments. But because we're on the peripheral route and we're influenced by these less important variables, when people make more arguments, people are more persuaded by that than if they make fewer arguments, as long as the audience is on the peripheral route to persuasion. Or as a last one, take source credibility. This one up here. So you might have heard things like 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate or something like that, right? What those ads are doing is trying to persuade you to buy their toothpaste by making the people who are making the argument highly credible. These are dentists. They know about teeth and toothpaste, right? Now, it's tempting to think that source credibility is a central route factor, But it turns out that it's not. It's a peripheral route factor. In other words, the arguments for why you should buy Colgate, let's say, should stand on their own. It doesn't matter whether a doctor says that Colgate is good for your teeth, or if someone else says Colgate is good for your teeth. If evidence is provided that it is good for your teeth, it doesn't matter who's making that claim, right? So, as a consequence, source credibility doesn't matter like argument quality does. It doesn't affect people who are on the central route. People on the central route consider the arguments on their own merits, regardless of who they come from. It's people who are on the peripheral route who are not really thinking about the quality of the arguments that might think, well, this person's more credible than this person, therefore I'm just going to go along with whatever they say. So source credibility is a peripheral route factor as well. So what I want to do over the course of the next 30, 45 minutes, something like that, is talk about what affects how we're persuaded. And I'm going to divide these factors into three different categories. So we're going to talk about a couple factors related to the audience of the message. We're going to talk about a couple of factors related to the source of the message, the person making the speech or giving the message. And finally, we're going to talk about factors related to the message itself that all affect how we're persuaded. So let's start with factors related to the audience. And there's really two main factors that we need to consider. The first of these factors is how involved the audience is in the argument. Another way of saying this is how relevant the argument is to your audience. Because if you're trying to make an argument to an audience of people, if what you're arguing affects your audience, it's related, it's relevant to their lives, they're going to be motivated to pay attention to you, right? They're going to start to consider and weigh the arguments you're making and to analyze them for their logical coherence, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, when an argument is relevant to someone, those people tend to be on the central route. They're motivated to think about it. On the other hand, if you're making an argument to an audience that's completely irrelevant to them, they don't care about this, they're not really motivated to think in depth. They're going to behave more mindlessly, right? Because they don't want to spend the cognitive effort required to really consider your arguments because it's meaningless to them. So if an audience is not involved in an issue, i.e., the issue is not relevant to them, then they're going to tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion, not the central route. And we know this from a number of studies. Okay, so for example, there was a study where a speaker came to talk to a high school audience. And what they were talking about was the need to institute these comprehensive exams. So basically, at the end of your 4 years of high school, you had to take this one final exam that covers all these courses that you took, and you had to pass that exam to graduate high school. So a speaker came in to talk about implementing the arguments for implementing this type of comprehensive exam. And for half of the participants, they were told that these exams were going to be instituted next year. So in other words, this was going to matter to them, right? They were going to have to take this exam if it gets implemented. So they're motivated to really consider if is this a good idea or not. Now, on the other hand, the other half of the audience was told that these exams won't take place for another 10 years. They're going to be graduated by then. It's not going to affect them at all, right? And when they conducted the study, what they found is that people who were told the exam's going to take place next year, they were considering the strength of the arguments. They could identify what was a good argument, what was a bad argument, because they were paying attention to them. But the people who were told the exams weren't going to take place for 10 years, they weren't involved in the issue. They were on the peripheral route to persuasion. They weren't paying attention to the arguments. They couldn't differentiate good from bad arguments because they weren't paying attention to the arguments in the first place. Okay. So in other words, an audience that's involved in an issue, i.e., the issue is relevant to them, they tend to be on the central route to persuasion. They consider the strength of the arguments. When an audience is not involved in the issue is not relevant to them, they tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion, and they don't analyze the strength of the arguments. A second audience-related factor that matters is what's known as need for cognition. Need for cognition is an individual difference variable, meaning it's like a personality factor that differs from individual to individual, hence the name individual difference variable. And it refers to the extent to which people enjoy effortful cognitive activities. So I've been saying so far that people tend not to like to think very much and we behave mindlessly. And in general, that's true, but there's a lot of variability from person to person. Some people don't like to think at all, but some people do like to think in depth about an issue. Some people enjoy thinking in depth, right? So what you can do is you can give people what's known as a need for cognition scale, in which they would answer, they're given a number of items and they have to answer whether each one applies to them or not. So for example, here are some items from the need for cognition scale. So if you take a look at some of these items, you can see that what the items are getting at is the extent to which you like to think, right? Like number two, thinking is not my idea of fun. Does that describe you or not? Do you agree or disagree? I like tasks that require little thought once I've learned them, et cetera, et cetera. So people would answer each of these questions or each of these items by indicating whether they agree with it or not. And on the basis of their responses, you can calculate their need for cognition score. So someone who answers um, yes to number one, I really enjoy a task that involves coming up with new solutions. If they answer all these items in a way that shows that they like to think, they would have a high need for cognition score. If they answer these questions in a way that indicates they don't like to think very much, so they answer yes to number two, for instance, thinking is not my idea of fun, and related questions, then they would have a low need for cognition score. So basically what we can do is then take people, take an audience of people, give them all this need for cognition scale, and we can divide them into people who are high in need for cognition, who scored high on the scale, and people who are low in need for cognition, who scored low on the scale. Now, what happens is that people who are high in need for cognition, because they like to think, that's what need for cognition means, because they like to think, they like to analyze arguments. If you give them arguments, they will think about them and they will logically evaluate them, right? So in other words, people who are high in need for cognition tend to be on the central route to persuasion. They tend to want to think about the arguments. Whereas people who are low in need for cognition, who don't like to think, they're not going to analyze arguments because they don't like to think, right? So they're going to naturally tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion. Now, what all of this means is that if you're a speaker, if you're trying to persuade an audience to do something, then you need to understand which route your audience is going to be on. Are they going to be on the central route or the peripheral route to persuasion? Because if they're on the central route to persuasion, then you need to convince them by giving them good arguments for your point. But if they're on the peripheral route to persuasion, giving them strong arguments isn't going to matter very much because they're not paying attention to them. So under those conditions, you might be better off including like attractive speakers or talking about credibility of the speaker or all these other peripheral route factors that matter more when your audience is on the peripheral route. Okay. One other variable that is related to the audience as well that you need to consider is the culture from which the audience comes from. We've talked about cultural differences before in this class between individualistic cultures and collectivist cultures. And so if you look at individualist cultures, a lot of the slogans that ads use in these individualistic cultures like ours emphasize the individualistic nature of that culture. So for example, you only better, a leader among leaders, make your way through the crowd. These are all slogans that people from Western individualist cultures tend to use because they're emphasizing the individualistic nature, right? You're a leader among leaders, make your way through the crowd, stand out, you only better, right? So these types of slogans work better in Western cultures than they do in Eastern cultures, because in Eastern cultures, or I should say collectivist cultures, they're less focused or they're less concerned about the individualistic nature, okay, of these types of ads. In collectivist cultures, the ads or the slogans that work best in those cultures tend to be things that are related to their interconnectedness, right? Which is what tends to differentiate, to a large extent, collectivist from individualist cultures. So the slogans they have might be things like, our family agrees with this selection of home furnishings. We have a way of bringing people closer together, a more exhilarating way to provide for your family. And you can see that these slogans emphasize the relationships that people have with others. So again, if you want to be maximally persuasive, you need to know the culture that your audience comes from so you can tailor your message accordingly. All right, so those are factors associated with the audience. Now, there's also factors associated with the source of the message, meaning the person who is giving or making the message, who's trying to persuade other people. And the first factor that matters that's related to the source is the credibility of the source. Now, credibility itself is composed of two components. First off, in order for someone to be credible, you have to perceive them as having expertise in an area. Okay. Presumably, part of the reason you hopefully perceive me as being credible in terms of social psychology is because you perceive me as having expertise in the area. I've got a doctorate degree in social psychology, for instance. But expertise alone is not enough to make someone credible. If you're, for instance, going to buy a used car and you go to a used car salesman, that person might have a lot of expertise about cars, but you may not trust them because they might be motivated to lie to you to make a commission off the cars they're selling, right? They're not very trustworthy. And so they're not very credible necessarily. And so the second component of credibility is trustworthiness. So speakers that have both expertise and trustworthiness tend to be more persuasive to people. But remember that I mentioned that credibility of the speaker is a peripheral route factor. People in the central route don't care about the credibility of the speaker. They only care about the arguments themselves. People on the peripheral route do care about the credibility of the speaker. So speakers who have expertise and are trustworthy are highly credible, but that only matters to people who are on the peripheral route to persuasion, right? So these credible speakers affect people on the peripheral route to persuasion. There's an interesting effect known as the sleeper effect that's related to credibility. I want you to imagine the following scenario, okay? So let's say that you are going grocery shopping, and as you're checking out, they've got like all the magazines at the checkout. And so you're looking over these magazines, and one of them says, like, scientists find cure for cancer, right? But then you notice it comes from the National Enquirer. Well, the National Enquirer is a very low credible source, right? We don't really trust the National Enquirer. And as a consequence, you think at the time, okay, I don't believe that scientists have found a cure for cancer because it's the National Enquirer who's making this claim. But what happens? What happens is that over time, we tend to remember information more than we remember where that information came from, which we tend to forget pretty easily. So maybe 2 weeks later, you're talking to your friends and you say, "Oh, wait, you know what? I read recently that scientists found a cure for cancer." But you forgot where you heard that information from. You forgot it came from the National Enquirer. In other words, you forgot it came from a non-credible source. As a consequence, you become more influenced by it. You might believe that scientists have actually found a cure for cancer. You didn't believe it at first because you knew it came from a non-credible source. But because you forgot that 2 weeks later, you now believe that information. So the sleeper effect refers to this tendency whereby a message can become more credible over time if it initially comes from a non-credible source. Then we forget the source of that message, and so it becomes more credible after a while. Another factor associated with the source of the message that affects its credibility or persuasiveness, persuasiveness is the likability of the person who is making the argument. Now, likability is also composed of two components. We tend to like people who are similar to us. After all, we saw before in the section on the self that we like ourselves an awful lot. And so if someone is just like me, I'm going to like them too, right? So we like people who are similar to us. This is partly the reason why in most political ads, politicians want to portray themselves as similar to voters. Now, the exception to this is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is an exception to all sorts of different political rules, but most of the time, politicians want to portray themselves as similar to their voters because they know that voters want to vote for someone who's similar to them, right? So even though a lot of politicians are really, really rich, they don't like to portray that they're rich, again, with the exception of Donald Trump. But most of them don't like to portray that they're rich because they know most of their voters are not rich like they are. So we like people who are similar to us. We also like people who we find physically attractive, whether that's physical attractiveness, or we also like celebrities as well. They have physical appeal to us. This is why you have a lot of celebrities endorsing things that have nothing to do with them, right? This is why soccer player Ronaldo is endorsing KFC. This is why David Beckham here in this case is endorsing a Sharpie pen. Like, why does it matter? If you're in the market to buy a pen, why does it matter if David Beckham endorses it or not, right? It doesn't really make sense, except for the fact that we tend to be persuaded by celebrities. We tend to be persuaded by attractive people. And so an attractive celebrity in particular is going to be particularly persuasive to us. So people who are on the peripheral route are going to tend to be sensitive to the likability of the speaker, right? Because it's not related to the arguments being made. So likability matters to people on the peripheral route, but it doesn't really matter to people on the central route because they don't care about that stuff. And let's talk about some factors related to the message itself that can affect its persuasive appeal. And we're going to talk about a couple related to whether someone who's making an ad or trying to persuade someone is relying on rational reason reasoned arguments or whether they're relying on producing an emotional reaction in their audience. So, for example, let's talk about whether fear appraisals work or not. So, what do I mean by a fear appraisal? Well, if you take a look at some, like, let's say billboards, right, or some ads, what they might try to do is to change your attitude towards something by scaring you, right? So, in this case, cocaine doesn't make you sexy, it makes you dead. They're trying to change your attitude towards cocaine by scaring you and saying you're going to die if you keep doing this, right? Or the tobacco industry made him history, Sammy Davis Jr., right? So, in other words, if you keep smoking, you're going to die just like him. These are attempts to scare you, right? So the question is, do these fear appraisals, do they work? Are they effective at changing people's attitudes? The answer is sometimes. Okay. Fear appraisals can work sometimes if the audience is told how to avoid the danger. In other words, if you say, if you don't quit using cocaine, it's going to kill you. But if you need help doing so, here's a number to call. Okay. You're told how to avoid it, then fear appraisals can work. But if you're not told how to avoid it, if you're just told if you keep doing cocaine, it's going to kill you, that tends not to be very effective. That tends to invoke, in a sense, cognitive dissonance. People are thinking like, I use cocaine, and you're telling me that I'm doing something that's going to kill myself. That's going to kill me. Like that produces that conflict that can produce cognitive dissonance, and people might therefore justify their behavior by convincing themselves it's not really much of a danger anyway, right? So fear appraisals on their own don't really work all that well, but they do work if you tell people how to avoid that negative outcome. What about the mood that someone is in when someone's trying to change their opinion on something? Well, typically what happens is that if you're in a positive mood, if you're feeling happy, then you tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion. In other words, if you're in a good mood, you don't necessarily want to start analyzing arguments. It's going to take you out of that good mood, right? And you want to maintain that good mood. So as a consequence, people in a good mood tend to be on the peripheral route to persuasion where they don't have to analyze arguments very much. Where people who are in a bad mood tend to be more likely to be on the central route to persuasion. They're more likely to analyze the strength of arguments. And there's a number of studies that demonstrate this. So for example, when people are eating while watching a TV show, they're more persuaded by peripheral route factors, like the attractiveness of the speaker, than when people are not eating, watching those same shows. And that's because eating makes us happy. Happy puts us on the peripheral route to persuasion. Or there's a study that shows that people who are watching comedies tend to be more persuaded by peripheral route factors than people who are watching dramas, because comedies make us happier than dramas do, typically, which puts us on the peripheral route to persuasion. So it's not that being in a happy or bad mood makes you more or less likely to be persuaded, but rather being in a happy mood puts you on the peripheral route to persuasion. So you're more sensitive to peripheral route factors compared to not being in a happy mood. What about the discrepancy of the message? What does that mean? Well, let's say that you're giving a speech on something and you've got an opponent, or sorry, you're giving a speech on something and your audience has a position on that topic, right? And so if you're trying to persuade them to change their opinion on that topic, you have a couple different strategies. One strategy is to take as discrepant, as different a position as possible from your audience to hopefully pull some of them at least a little of the way towards you. Okay. Another option is you can take a position that's just a little bit different from your audience and try to pull them, try to convince them of that. So the question is, which of these strategies is better? In other words, how discrepant should your position be from the audience in order to have maximum persuasive appeal? How extreme a position should you take to maximize attitude change? So let's take a look at a very extreme organization, the Westboro Baptist Church. These are people who have done a lot of things. One of the things that they've done is they've gone to the funerals of American soldiers who died in battle, and they hold up signs like this: "Thank God for dead soldiers, you're going to hell," that sort of thing. Obviously, not a very common position, right? Obviously, I mean, these are not good people that do this, right? Obviously, if they go to a funeral, the people at the funeral, the loved ones of this soldier who just died, they're gonna have a very, very different position than this guy here, right? Obviously, they're gonna have a lot of respect for soldiers, whereas this guy does not have a lot of respect for soldiers. So this position is very, very discrepant from the audience he's trying to convince. And so the question is, does taking such a discrepant position actually work at changing people's attitudes? And the answer is generally no. It doesn't really work because if you have too extreme a position from your audience, they won't even give you the time of day. They won't even start to pay attention to you because you're so discrepant that they're not even going to bother, right? It's not like the loved ones of these fallen soldiers are going to have a discussion with this guy to see if he has any rational arguments. They're going to recognize that he's so extreme, there's no point in even acknowledging him, right? And so taking a moderate position, taking a position that's only a little bit different from your audience, tends to be maximally persuasive because people won't reject you immediately. They'll at least pay attention to the arguments that you're making. Sometimes when you're making an argument, you have the option of giving what's known as a one-sided argument or a two-sided argument. What that means is whether you should acknowledge the opposing point of view. So, for example, if you are giving a speech on something, um, for reasons why we should institute this new policy, for instance. You could either talk about just the benefits of your policy and why you should institute it, and that's it. And if you do that, that would be a one-sided argument. Or you could talk about the benefits of your policy, but then you could talk about what your opponent's position is, why they oppose the policy, and then try to shoot down their arguments. That would be a two-sided argument. So the question is, should you acknowledge the opposing viewpoints or not? What is better in terms of trying to persuade people? Well, this depends. One-sided arguments are more persuasive if one of the following two things are true. If either the audience already agrees with you, so in other words, if what you're saying the audience already agrees with, then there's not really much point in bringing up the opposing viewpoints, okay? Because no one's persuaded by them anyway, so there's no point in bringing them up. As a consequence, a one-sided argument is more persuasive than a two-sided argument if the audience already agrees with you. Or if the audience isn't aware of opposing views, then by giving a two-sided argument, all you're doing is making them aware of what the opposite perspective is. They weren't aware of it before. So now they might be influenced by that opposing perspective. So giving a one-sided argument is better in both of these cases. But in all other cases, two-sided arguments are more persuasive. Because if your audience already knows what the opposing viewpoint is, well, if you don't bring it up, then they still know what the opposing viewpoint is, right? You haven't shot any holes in it. So what you need to do in that case is bring up the opposing viewpoint and then argue why that viewpoint is wrong. Well, what if you are making an argument? You've got an opponent making an argument as well. Is it better to go first or to go last? Well, like a lot of things in this section, it depends. In this case, it depends on the timing of those speeches or of those arguments that are being given. So let's say, for instance, that you are a politician, right? And so you're going to make a speech in front of an audience, and your opponent who's running against you is also going to make a speech. Is it better to go first or to go last? What's going to be more influential to people? Well, let's say that you've got message one that's being given. You've got message two that's being given immediately afterwards. And then after some length of time, the audience decides who they want to go with. So this was the case in the example I just gave you, right? So maybe you're going to give a speech in front of an audience, your opponent's going to give a speech, and then next week, the audience is going to vote for one of you, right? In this case, it is better to go first because by going first, you're laying the foundation. And we talked about confirmation biases before. Once you give a message to an audience and they form that general foundation, they start to look for information that supports their pre-existing beliefs. So they start interpreting the second message in light of their pre-existing beliefs about your message. So it tends to be more persuasive if you go first. There's a primacy effect where going first ends up being more persuasive. On the other hand, there are conditions where maybe someone gives a message, but then there's a big time delay before someone else gives a message and the audience votes afterwards. And under these conditions, when there's a big gap between the messages themselves, it's better to go last. And that's because when people are deciding which message they agree with, the second message is fresh on their mind. It just happened. The first message happened a long time ago. They've forgotten about it and they're less persuaded by it. So there's a recency effect whenever there's a big time gap between the first message and the second message. All right, what about subliminal messages? Subliminal messages are messages that are presented to you below your level of awareness. So for example, right now on the screen, I could be flashing messages so quickly that you're not even aware of registering of them. You don't even like know they're being presented to you. So if I were to flash things like um, drink Coke um, subliminally, would that affect your behavior? Would you be more likely to drink Coke than if I did not flash those things to you? That's what a subliminal message is. And subliminal messages really started to be considered a lot in like the 1950s, and partly on the basis of this one guy who owned a drive-in movie theater, who claimed that for a while he had been presenting subliminal messages to the people who went to his drive-in theater. And in particular, he said he was showing the messages drink Coke, eat popcorn subliminally, and that increased his popcorn and Coke sales. So, and on the basis of this, people started to worry because if we could be influenced by subliminal messages, that means we can be controlled by all sorts of people and we wouldn't even know that we're being controlled. And so, like grocery stores started to put subliminal messages in some of the music they would play. Things like, if you steal, you'll get caught. But they would say that at a level where the people in the grocery store couldn't even register it, under the belief that presenting that message subliminally will lead to a decrease in shoplifting behavior. In fact, the band Judas Priest went to trial over a claim that they had included subliminal messages in their music. And in particular, some claimed there was a family who claimed that they had included a subliminal message that just said "do it," which I guess. And what happened is that their kids committed suicide as a consequence of this. And the claim was that they committed suicide because of that subliminal message in Judas Priest's music. So, do subliminal messages actually work to change our behavior? In fact, you can see online all sorts of ways that people claim you can improve your life via subliminal messages. These are like organizations that will sell you, you know, well, I guess back in the day, they would sell you tapes where you put a tape in a tape player and you would listen to music, but in the background, there would be subliminal messages. And according to these people, you can improve your life just by playing these messages in the background, playing these tapes in the background while you do whatever you do. And so you could find people that claim you could do things like lose weight just by listening to these subliminal messages, or you could stop smoking, or boost your self-esteem, or increase your energy, or improve your memory, seduce women, clear up your skin. I guess acne responds to subliminal messages, apparently. Stop stuttering, stop bedwetting if that's an issue. Stop irritable bowel syndrome. All of these things and more can be yours if you just send $200 to this organization and they'll send you a tape with subliminal messages. However, the problem is that none of this actually works. Okay. As a general rule, subliminal messages have no effect on your behavior. If you're not aware of a message, it doesn't affect you. There are some little exceptions to this. In very specific circumstances and very tightly controlled circumstances, you can show some effects of subliminal messages, but nothing like controlling us to eat popcorn or buy Coke or anything like that. In fact, the drive-in theater, they weren't actually showing subliminal messages. They just claimed that they were because they wanted to get some publicity to get people to go to their theater. So they just made that story up. That wasn't actually true. So subliminal messages don't actually work at changing our behavior, but people think that they do. So if you tell people you're giving them a subliminal message, they will think that it's causing their behavior to change as long as they believe in the power of subliminal messages. So for example, a study looked at this. What they did is they had participants, they gave them a tape that had subliminal messages on it. Now, half of the tapes were labeled improve your self-esteem, and half of the tapes were labeled lose weight. Okay. So that's what the participants thought that they were getting. So, but what happened is that what the researchers actually did is they mislabeled half of the tapes. So, in other words, some participants thought they were getting a tape that had subliminal messages about raising their self-esteem, but in reality, the subliminal messages were about losing weight. And some of the participants got a tape that they thought was about losing weight, but in reality, it had subliminal messages about boosting their self-esteem. So they give participants one of these tapes. The participants listen to them at home. They come back into the lab, and the researchers ask them whether their self-esteem improved since they were there last and whether they lost weight. And what happens is that among participants who thought they got an improve your self-esteem tape, they say, oh, yeah, my self-esteem is much better now than it was before. And when you ask them if they lost weight, they say, well, no, I didn't lose any weight in that time. And that's true even among the participants who actually got the lose weight tape, right? They think their self-esteem improved. And similarly, the people who thought they got the lose weight tape, they say, yeah, I lost weight since I was here. And when you ask them if their self-esteem is higher, they say, well, no, my self-esteem isn't boosted. And that's true even among the people who actually got a tape where there were subliminal messages about boosting their self-esteem. In other words, subliminal messages don't have an impact on our behavior. What happens is that if we think we're getting a tape with a certain subliminal message on it, we think that it's changing our behavior. It's basically a placebo effect, in other words. And this doesn't stop people, though, from looking for all sorts of subliminal messages in ads and in movies and TV shows. This is a kind of a famous shot from The Lion King. It's kind of hard to see here because the resolution's kind of low. But basically, people claim that in the dust that's kicked up when Simba lies down, the lion lies down here, you can make out the word sex. Okay. I don't know if you can see that very well here. You can see it a little bit better when there's actual motion, when there's better resolution than I have here. Well, that's what people claim. And they claim that the animators put words like sex in the background of their movies because people have positive associations with sex. And so if they see the word, they'll feel good and they'll think it's the movie that's making them feel good, right? Now, there's at least three explanations for what's going on here. The first explanation is that the animators did try to put a subliminal message in this movie. I don't think that's what actually happened, but that is one possible explanation. A second explanation is that, in fact, there's nothing going on here, but rather what happens is that as humans, we have a tendency to see patterns in completely random data. This happens all the time. You can show someone random things and they'll see patterns in that thing. So it could be the case that this is just random white dots on a screen, and people, because they're looking for the word sex, for example, they'll see it even though it doesn't actually exist. The third explanation, which I think is the one that's most likely, is that the animators wanted to put an Easter egg in the movie. And in particular, they wanted to put an Easter egg for themselves. They're the special effects team. And so what they did is they put SFX in the dust. And SFX is a lot like SEX. So this could actually say SFX to call out the special effects team, but people are misinterpreting it or misperceiving it as SEX. But people look for these subliminal messages all the time, even if they may not exist. So here's one from the 80s where Pepsi released a different type of can. And if you align two cans on top of each other, if you look down those cans, it seems like it spells out maybe SEX, possibly. And some people claim that was deliberate on the part of Pepsi to try to subliminally influence people to buy their product. I don't know. I'll leave it up to you to decide if you think that this was deliberate or not. Here's an example. Some people have claimed that there's a subliminal message in this ad. I doubt it. I think this is almost certainly an instance of people seeing patterns in completely random data, especially when they go looking for certain patterns. So you can see all sorts of squiggles, right? This is what I mean, like random data, just random squiggles. But if you look hard enough, you can sort of make out the word sex here, possibly SCX. I mean, it's a bit of a stretch, right? I doubt it. I think this is just random data, but because people go looking, especially for the word SEX, they can find it in this sort of random data. But I don't think there was any attempt to put anything subliminal in this ad. Here's an ad where there surely was an attempt to put some sort of subliminal message in here. I'll give you a second if you want to try to find it yourself. Well, if you haven't found it, take a look at the glass in here. And in particular, take a look at the lighting in the glass. And if you go from top to bottom, you can spell out the word SEX. Oops, sorry. Right, SEX. So chances are in this case, the people who made this ad did try to put the subliminal message in. I don't know if they did it as a joke or to try to increase sales, but regardless, it's not going to actually work. You're not going to see this ad and be like, oh, I want to buy Gilby's gin now, right? That's not going to influence people. So just to give you an overview of what we talked about so far in this lecture, these are all the factors that we have discussed that can affect our likelihood of being persuaded. I'm not going to go over them again because we already discussed them, but I wanted to put them in one place if it helps you study. But I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about resisting persuasion, because I've talked a lot about how to maximally persuade people, but I want to talk about how people resist persuasion as well. The first thing I want to mention or talk about is what's known as attitude inoculation. So when you get an actual inoculation, like a vaccine for something, you're effectively being injected with a dead or very weakened version of that thing. So if you get a flu vaccine, you're being injected with the flu. It's just that the flu is either dead or very, very weakened. With the idea being that when you're injected with a very weakened version of the flu, your body will produce antibodies to it. So when a real version of the flu comes along, you're ready to fight it off, right? There's an analogy here between medical vaccinations and sort of the psychological idea of attitude inoculation. What the researchers say is that being exposed to a weak version of an argument increases people's resistance to that argument later on. So, for example, if I were to tell you that in 10 minutes from now, someone else is going to come in here and they're going to try to change your attitudes, your political beliefs, it becomes harder to change your beliefs than if I didn't tell you that. Just giving you a forewarning, in other words, that someone's going to try to change your mind on something, someone's going to try to change your attitude, tends to harden you from those attempts, tends to inoculate you from those attempts. So, for example, a study looked at this. They went to I think it was a high school, and they made an argument for raising the legal driving age from 16 to 18. And half of the students were told 15 minutes beforehand that someone was going to try to do this. And the other half of the students were not given that heads up. They were just presented with the speaker immediately. And afterwards, everybody rated how much they agreed with the speaker. And what they showed is that people who were just presented with this speaker right away without any forewarning, they came to agree with them somewhat. Their attitudes actually changed. But among the students who were given the 15-minute warning first, their attitudes didn't change at all. They were not convinced by this person whatsoever. They had been inoculated, in other words, from this attempt to change their attitudes. And this happens for a couple of reasons. First off, if you're given 15 minutes warning before someone comes and tries to change your attitude, you have 15 minutes to come up with all sorts of counter arguments to what they're saying, right? So these students who were told that someone's going to try to convince them to raise the legal driving age from 16 to 18, they have 15 minutes to come up with reasons why that's a bad idea. So they're prepared for the speaker. Furthermore, there's sort of this motivational reaction that comes along with this. If I tell you someone's going to try to change your political opinions in 15 minutes, your natural reaction oftentimes is going to be like, oh yeah, just try it. Because we don't like to think that we're easily manipulated like that. We like to think that there's a reason behind a lot of our beliefs and attitudes, right? So we don't react well when we hear that other people are trying to change our attitudes. And so if we know that people are trying to manipulate us, we sort of steel ourselves to that. We become less able to be manipulated. And that motivational reaction that we have is something known as psychological reactance. What this means is that if you perceive that someone is trying to take away one of your freedoms, we don't like that very much. We like the freedoms that we have to make our own choices, to be independent, autonomous people. And if we feel like someone's not allowing us to do that, we want to re-exert that freedom. That freedom that's being threatened becomes even more attractive. So, for example, this is a great instance of psychological reactance. So there's a sign that says absolutely no machete juggling. And the man says, suddenly I have an urge to juggle machetes. Now, he didn't have that urge before that sign, right? But as soon as the sign says you can't do something, suddenly we want to do that thing. That's what psychological reactance is. And it happens because we don't like to think that other people can just take away our ability to juggle machetes or whatever. We don't like that. So we react against it. And what that means as far as persuasion is concerned is that if I try too hard to change your opinion, if I say I'm going to change your opinion on this topic, your natural tendency is to move in the opposite direction. So if I say I'm going to try to convince you of why you should never do drugs, you might become more pro-drug to try to, because you're perceiving this person as taking away a freedom of yours. You get to choose if you want to try drugs. And so if I'm saying you can't do them, that makes you want to do them more to re-exert that freedom that you think I'm taking away from you. And we see psychological reactance a lot. Right? And what it means is that these persuasion attempts can backfire. So I might go in to try to change your opinion on something, as I said, to try to, let's say, make you more anti-drug, but because of psychological reactance, you might become more pro-drug. So my very attempt to persuade you has backfired and led you to move in the opposite direction. We see psychological reactance in all sorts of places. So for example, studies have looked at teenagers who were in dating relationships. And what they showed in this one study was that teenagers in these relationships whose parents disagreed with the relationship, those relationships lasted longer than when the parents did agree. Because it's like these teenagers are dating each other and their parents don't like it. And they say, like, they don't like the idea that their parents can tell them who they can date. And so to sort of stick it to their parents, they're going to say, well, I'm going to show you, I'm going to stick with this relationship even longer, right? They move in an opposite direction than their parents are trying to get them to. This is partly why censorship doesn't work very well. Because as soon as you tell someone you're not allowed to read this book, or you're not allowed to watch this show, or you're not allowed to listen to this music, we perceive that as this person trying to take away our freedoms, our choices to do those things. And we want to re-exert those freedoms. So it makes us want to read that book or watch that TV show or listen to that music. So warning stickers that tell you not to do something can have the exact opposite effect because it produces the sense of psychological reactance in people. One study looked at this. What they did is they went to public restrooms around the city and they put one of two signs on the walls. So in half of the restrooms was placed a sign that said something like, please don't write on the walls. And in the other half of the bathrooms, they placed a sign that said something like, under no triple underlined circumstances should you ever, capital letters, write on this wall, right? It was very, very harsh in their face. So the researchers leave, they come back a week or two later, and they simply count how much graffiti is on these walls. And what they showed is that the sign that said, under no circumstances should you ever write on these walls, there was more graffiti on those walls than under the sign that just said, please don't write on the walls. Because again, what happened is that by telling people you're not allowed to do something at all, you cannot do this, that made people want to do it, right? People would go into the bathroom and say, and they'd see, like, under no circumstances should you write on these walls. They'd say, like, I'll show you, I'll write all over these walls if I want to, right? That's what psychological reactance is. And so the very attempt to try to change people's attitudes, if it's too blatant, if it's perceived as trying to take away their freedom to do something, can backfire and produce the exact opposite effect. Okay, that's all I've got for persuasion. We still have two types of social influence left. We're going to continue next class by talking about compliance. And I will see you then.